Good evening. I'm Valerie Paley, New York Historical's Senior Vice President and Chief Historian and Director of its Center for Women's History. I'm so pleased to welcome you to Curator Confidential, a live virtual program exclusively for members and other supporters of our organization. I trust that you are all safe and well. This summer, I was delighted to be your host for the History Hour series with Harold Holzer, and it is a thrill, now that the museum is once again open, to have the opportunity to share the work that went into the making of the exhibition Women March, currently on view in our Joyce B. Cowan Women's History Gallery at New York Historical. Before I begin, I want to take a moment to thank all of our trustees, our Chairman's Council, and all of our members and other donors for your generosity. It is only through your support and dedication to our programs that we can continue to make history matter. Our program will last approximately 45 minutes, including 15 minutes for questions and answers at the end, which I invite you to submit throughout the program by using the Q&A function on your Zoom screen at any point during the presentation. We've disabled the chat function, so please do make sure to use Q&A. After the presentation, I'll get to as many questions as time allows. Now, as you probably know, the Center for Women's History is the first such center of its kind within the walls of a major museum in the United States. The bricks and mortar of it opened only around 3 years ago. In that time, our Joyce B. Cowan Women's History Gallery has hosted 8 major exhibitions, including the current one, Women March. This evening, I'm going to divide my half-hour talk into 6 different aspects of that show. And because I encourage you to visit our museum on Central Park West in New York City to see Women March in the flesh, so to speak, I will not give you a tour per se, but I will focus tonight's program instead on some of the confidential part of the curatorial experience crafting the show. In other words, to let you know what choices we made behind the scenes and perhaps why. So, with the commemoration of the centennial of the 19th Amendment this year, removing sex as a barrier to the vote, the Center for Women's History was, of course, expected to do a suffrage centennial exhibition. A typical narrative would perhaps start with the first wave, 1848, Seneca Falls, proceed to the second wave, the 1960s, and the activism of that time. Maybe consider some of the major players in the story: Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Susan B. Anthony, Betty Friedan, Gloria Steinem. But we always challenge ourselves to take an unexpected approach that considers what people may already know and expands on that and complicates it by turning the conventional narrative on its head. Thus, of the many approaches we could have taken for this show, we chose as an organizing premise the concept of collective action, of unknown players coming together, marching together. The diversity of the movement, the intersectionality of it before there was such a term, and to march headlong as curators into the messiness and complexity of the suffrage story. So this wasn't just a 100-year thing. This is a 200+ year trajectory that we consider in this show. We think of maybe disrupting this whole wave theory, first wave, second wave, third wave, which sometimes can be more of a hindrance to thinking about women's history than a help. And it considers issues that extend beyond suffrage, including anti-slavery, civil rights, conservatism, environmentalism, not all of which intersected with the women's rights story. So I will first consider this: many goals, one method. Imagine a time when it was just a fact of life that 51% of the American population were not eligible to vote. That's because they were women. Now, this isn't to say that they had no political power. Women found it through rising up together and speaking out through collective action. Women March honors the efforts of those women whose names have not necessarily been memorialized in textbooks and whose names we may never even know. This show represents 2 centuries of their march to a full and uncompromised citizenship, demonstrating how women's rights indeed are human rights. We see the evolution of this work of recognizing the vote as a right towards using the vote as a tool for change. So the passage of the 19th Amendment that we celebrate this year, the so-called suffrage amendment, was not necessarily a triumphal step and an end in of itself, but rather a step along the way to fuller political empowerment. And we also learned in our work and in this show that the vote was one of many issues and causes that galvanized women's collective action. Their work impacted not only American women, but all American people. And we see with a changing cultural and political landscape over 2 centuries, some of their tactics remained remarkably consistent, but some changed. So we say many goals, one method. The method was organizing collectively and quite simply, metaphorically and literally by marching. And here we see an installation shot of the way the ambience of the show, life-size graphics and film, so that visitors can feel that they're walking with these participants of history. So next I want to consider Seneca Falls, the Seneca Falls moment and beyond. In the early 19th century, women took inspiration from Protestant revivalism to claim a moral justification for improving society. We'll see the very first introductory gallery where we see women lining in white dresses lining up for church, as well as a burning building after some women spoke out against slavery, a mixed crowd. It was a very, it was a scandalous thing for not only for women to be speaking out, but for them to be speaking out to men and women combined. But women were also tasked with being the moral arbiters of this new nation, the so-called Republican motherhood, calling them to action as the instructors of their children, their young children, sons really, on how to behave as citizens. And this was a task that fell to women. But the typical story of suffrage conventionally begins a little later with the Declaration of Sentiments. Here we have an excerpt from it. In 1848, attendees at a women's rights convention in Seneca Falls, New York, signed a list of grievances based on the Declaration of Independence. And you see here, we hold these truths to be self-evident that all men and women are created equal. And it's a very powerful moment in putting the idea of women's equality and also women's suffrage on the table. But you have to consider the fact that Seneca Falls did not spring up out of nowhere. Incidentally, this text that you see here is reproduced in its entirety in a very dynamic sort of technological feat of rolling through the Declaration of Sentiments, so you can just sort of feel it and read along with it while you're in the gallery. So women, by the Seneca Falls moment, had already been in the process of creating benevolent societies, of opposing slavery and Indian removal, of seeking to improve wages and factories, and articulating these ideas of women's rights. Black and white women both did this through giving speeches, writing books and articles, helping fugitive slaves, running schools, and yes, holding conventions. Petitions were also important. Without the vote, petitioning was a way to get opinions to legislators. And here on this large wall, it's like a 10-foot high wall, we see women's names signing different petitions. They signed their names to so many petitions to Congress that the House passed a gag rule in 1836, forbidding petitions altogether. Now, you'll see when you come and see this, the exhibition in the flesh, that some of the names are of very young girls, ages 12, 14, for example, and they sign their age along with their names. Petitions we see as a long-lived activist tool, and they appear in multiple places throughout our exhibition. The right to petition is guaranteed by the First Amendment. But by the late 1850s, many women realized the limits of their moral appeals and sought to engage with partisan politics and other forms of influence. So in this show, we see petitioning as a kind of early form of marching. So there is no question that the meeting at Seneca Falls, convened by the outsized suffragist, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, represented a critical tipping point. But as a choice in this exhibition, my curatorial team and I have foregrounded instead this collective activity of women, the petitioners, for example, and later those who showed up to marches and to meetings, to make a point that change depends not only on the more famous leaders of movements, but on those who come out in support of them. By the way, I have to add at this juncture that working with my curatorial team of scholars at the Center for Women's History was also a collective activity in and of itself. We have a remarkable array of pre and postdoctoral fellows, very generously funded by the Mellon Foundation, as well as other staffers who are deeply engaged in how we look at narrative, how we look at the broad sweep of American history, and always find the angle that foregrounds women to amplify our understanding of history writ large. So among my team, this is a chronological show, goes over 200 years. Each section in the show had a lead curator or a set of curators specializing in that particular era or subject area. And it was my purpose to harness all of these great ideas and to sort of look above and see into the details. And while they got in the weeds, I was able to look from the helicopter up above. And what a thrill indeed to see this exhibition come to fruition. Next, I want to consider the diversity of issues beyond the vote and the diversity of the people involved in the suffrage story. Demonstrating this diversity was another key takeaway for the curatorial team. We are all bound up together. We aim to evoke these different time periods in 200 years, as I had mentioned, through visceral, provocative use of imagery and video, projected life size, as you've seen in some of the gallery shots, to allow visitors to march with the people of the past. And the woman who uttered these words was no exception. In 1866, the African-American activist and suffragist Frances Ellen Watkins Harper spoke at the 11th Women's Rights Convention here in New York City, the first one held since the end of the Civil War. Now, the 13th Amendment had abolished slavery, but left questions of citizenship and voting rights unanswered and on the minds of Black and white men and women in attendance at this meeting. And it was important to us that Harper's potent and eloquent words ring out early in the exhibition. And to that end, we created a kind of hologram with the actress Ariana DeBose portraying her giving the speech. And here is an excerpt from it.
We are all bound up together in one great bundle of humanity. And society cannot trample on the weakest and feeblest of its members without receiving the curse in its own soul.
It is extraordinarily dramatic, and Ariana, who is a wonderful champion of our center, in fact, she cast the voices for our film, which screens in our auditorium on the half hour We Rise. She cast all the women's voices for that. She is a remarkable actress who's a Tony Award nominee and is now making quite a splash in film as well. And to have her evoke this extraordinary figure in the suffrage story it's a thrill, even if you didn't know the process by which we came to film her doing it. So it is a wonderful, wonderful aspect of that first gallery in the exhibition. In any case, Frances Harper, who she is portraying, expressed ideas of intersectionality, the inextricable links of between gender, race, and class, before the term even existed in 1866. It would take another 100 years or so for that to happen. Speaking of her own particular experience as a Black woman living in America. She challenged listeners to see that working collectively to expand rights for all Americans would strengthen the nation but it required acknowledging inequality. So women sought to address racism, to address wages and work conditions and other inequalities through gaining the vote. The 19th Amendment led to more activism to enact goals of suffragists, further expand citizenship, and address disenfranchisement. But along the way, national and local groups worked to get suffrage referendums on state ballots and introduce an amendment in Congress. These women called attention to their cause through pageantry and spectacle. This is not a dignified thing in the 19th century for women to even walk on the streets unaccompanied by a chaperone. And here they are picketing the White House, for example, or marching in the streets. Women changed their ideas about propriety in the early 20th century by marching and using these new forms of public spectacle. But this isn't to say that suffragists didn't always agree on tactics or philosophy. There was a wide range of arguments for the vote, as diverse as the movement itself. Women should vote because they were mothers, or because they worked for the war, because they wanted to stop lynching, or because they worked and wanted to improve factory conditions. And there was also an equally wide range of tactics. Should they work state by state or work for a federal amendment? Play by the rules or be more radical? Go for the spectacle or the backroom politicking? All these were interesting approaches, and they were all on the table. And importantly enough, suffrage was not the only focus, but it was a tool to achieve these larger goals. Marching, here in this image, we see stenographers. Now, the working class suffrage perspective was to seek the vote to improve wages, work conditions, hours, treatment, etc. We saw in the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire, for example, in the early 20th and the 19 teens in New York. But that perspective was sometimes and often different from the middle class perspective. We had different challenges and a different concept of what was needed by gaining the vote. So in our curatorial work, we found inspiration in the great diversity of the suffrage story, something that isn't always apparent in textbooks. But we also had to deal with the uneasy and complex and complicated truth of intermittent racism in the movement. To wit, not all white suffragists wanted Black women or immigrants to vote. But we couldn't throw the baby out with the bathwater. It's a very complicated story, and history is by nature messy. So we see there were multiple movements for the vote, as I just expressed, and the 19th Amendment was still ratified in 1920. It was a victory for sure, but it did not give women the right to vote. As I've said, I think previously, it removed sex as an obstacle to the vote. And some big goals of the suffragists became law right away, but there was still widespread disenfranchisement. For example, Black women were disenfranchised by state laws that allowed poll taxes or literacy tests. Violence kept some voters away. US citizens who married foreigners, also Asian American women, Native American women, all were not considered citizens and therefore could not vote as other American women could. So we also learn about just how things didn't just end in 1920, but they were in fact a step along the way. For example, the Equal Rights Amendment, which we often associate with the 1970s, in fact, the National Women's Party introduced it in 1923. But working women were wary of losing protective laws, and this is what made it a bit more complicated and took up the cause again good 50 years later. Different groups wanted the vote for their own reasons, but for the most part worked together to make it happen. This is a theme we see over the arc of the entire exhibit. Collective action requires cooperation and coalitions. Now, here we see, again, very life-size images of different groups of women, but at the end, you see embedded in that wonderful image, this Women Register, the League of Women Voters image, is an interactive, which we see up close in the next slide. This shows voting rights, and it allows visitors to learn about voting rights in each state through federal law through the years. And you could slide the slider back and forth and see which states allowed what as early as 1820, and then moving right into present day. Now, there are a lot of surprises here, and it's fascinating. You would assume perhaps that in 1920 you would see suffrage for all in all of the states, but in fact you see in the legend on the right that only 24 states out of 52 states or territories allowed suffrage for all women. So, this is a very complex story, and instead of writing up little labels that convey that, we like our visitors to engage more directly with some of the issues, and certainly this kind of interactive work does help make it happen. As a public historian and when working at the New York Historical Society, which is, as you all know, New York City's oldest museum, I am so incredibly fortunate to have its rich collections at my disposal to help me and the teams that I direct to flesh out historical narratives in ways that speak viscerally to the past. But archives can only go so far. And we've also seen the great value of film and technology, the value of the visceral, I call it in my next section here. Interactives and technology do help convey stories and engage our visitors more directly in content. There's only so much content one can read on a label. If the label is going to be longer than 100 words, you might as well just go home and read a book. But how can we not dumb down this complex history and instead find ways to draw our visitors into the story? Often film and technology, interactive technology in particular, they do help make that happen. And in the early 20th century, certainly film was a great help to the suffragists who were trying to push the passage of the 19th Amendment across the finish line. And film became a new tool for activists. People would go to the little movie theaters and see short subjects before the feature film, and learn a bit about current events in ways that were as engaging then, certainly as they are now. And we see in this exhibition how film really does help advance an agenda, but also provocatively display, a time and a place. So the spectacle of suffrage parades was popular on film, and we have here a film of the silent march against lynching in 1917. We can run it if it's running. Here we go. The thousands of African Americans, men, women, and children, marched in silence with perhaps the drumbeat punctuating their march. And this was organized by the NAACP. Black suffragists saw the vote as a key to reducing racial violence, and certainly this drew attention. This particular silent march was against lynching in 1917. You'll see also the familiar steps of St. Patrick's Cathedral right there. So this is right down Fifth Avenue in our city, New York. Using this kind of video in the exhibition design truly helped advance the story and the narrative, and it was very exciting for people to feel through these life-size environmental graphics and some of the moving imagery. To give them a sense that they're part of the past, marching with these suffragists. And there you see it again. We also do like, I guess pre-COVID, we were very fond of being able to use technology where we could touch screens, etc. And a biographical interactive that we developed with the aid of our teen historians, our teen leaders, helped us in a show that is based primarily on the ideas of collective action to be able to dive a little bit deeper into the stories of some known and some unknown leaders. And working with these young women and men was quite a treat for not only my curatorial team, but for the tech team that helped create the coding, et cetera, for this interactive. And here are the teens looking at their work for the first time. We have another slide of them engaging more directly with their work. And they were just as thrilled as we were, and just a wonderful thing to be able to work collaboratively with our educators and other departments in New York Historical. So we also, I want to show some film as we use it in the section that focuses on the 1930s to the 60s, often thought of as this sort of fallow period in women's activism, women's rights. And in fact, it is not at all. Women remained on the march through union parades, government films that encourage war work, school desegregation protest in New York City, and films of women registering at a newly desegregated school. And there is the large projection right there that you see. And we also see adjacent to this section imagery of women activists with signs for voter registration. And this is in the 1950s, and we see how often sort of things stay very much the same as much as they change, as they say. This period, we can move to the next slide, please, is a period of civil rights, of activism that tied women's activism to intersecting problems like economic crisis, war, segregation. And you'll see also that, in fact, this is a little card from 1944, signed by Rosa Parks, who was, as we all know, pivotal in the Montgomery bus boycott in 1955. But in 1944, she was an activist who was the secretary of the Montgomery chapter at the NAACP. As we move into our own time, we enter a section that we call "This is what a feminist looks like." And in asking what it means to organize collectively as women, we acknowledge that women's experiences are shaped by a host of other social forces, such as class, race, sexuality, language, national origin, among many other things. As a result, many of the women's movements were contentious because they were about different things, but they succeeded through building strong principled coalitions. In the late 1960s and early 70s, a movement for women's liberation exploded into national consciousness. An increasingly diverse group of women pushed for social and legal equality beyond the vote. In the final gallery, we look at this women's movement and see that it was really many movements, including political participation, but also looking at systemic sexism and other inequalities. We see the personal is political. Through consciousness raising, women realize that many of their individual struggles stem from larger systemic conditions of a male-dominated society. Try to draw attention to that. And we see at the end of this gallery, by the way, 4 images at once. This sort of predates the Zoom screens that we're all, or Zoom rooms that we're all familiar with now, but back then, it was hard to explain to our film and tech and exhibition designers what exactly I had in mind. So I called it Brady Bunch, but now we can call it a Zoom room. And there's Phyllis Shapley, you see, and Bella Abzug, Ruby D. In any case, through consciousness raising, women realize that many of their individual struggles stem from the systemic conditions of this male-dominated society. And we see that there are different opinions that are, that women are coming together in different ways using their voices. And in this last gallery, we hear women's voices loud and clear, chants from marches, these women on these in this rotation of screens talking, and we feel the sort of visceral element as we enter our own time and see how how some things are so embedded in history. Emerging activists have pushed for new ideologies and forms of action. Um, and we think here of feminism as something that's broadly constructed as the advocacy of women's rights and equality as human rights, pure and simple. We see issue-driven marches and different objects and ephemera we have in the vitrine there. And we move from gender equivalence to equality for a variety of identities and many issues such as gun control, indigenous rights, climate, queer, lesbian, trans identities. We see the role of technology and global organizing. Petitioning now happens online, the internet, social media, apps, Me Too. They're all powerful expressions of the changing climate and how we use contemporary technology for advantageously. So activism is not necessarily in person now, as it was back a century ago. And connecting previously isolated groups can happen online through many different ways. We see marching as something that's mainstream. And we see also at the end of the story, a big takeaway, a call to action. These women worked and men worked incredibly hard to gain the vote in 1920, and a very hard-won victory indeed. So go out and use it. Go out and vote. We have a wonderful iPad at the end of the gallery at which people can sign up or see if they are registered to vote. And hopefully our visitors will be able to use that and benefit from it and feel inspired by this historical narrative, the story of women's suffrage, to go out and use their rights by voting. So we are at a Q&A moment of our program, and I see we do have a couple of questions already. And please do continue to send in your questions, and I'll try to answer them if I have the answers to them. Question, did you find any interesting examples or stories of intergenerational activism? Grandmothers, mothers, daughters marching together. This is a really wonderful question, and it's one that perhaps like members of my team could express, but I think that not specifically. But what we do find is how women, for example, in the 60s and 70s, very inspired by the stories of the past. By Alice Paul, for example, who first put the ERA on the table in the 1920s. 50 years later, she was still alive, and the ERA wasn't yet passed, and still is not. And they feel a sisterhood with these activists from the past, and perhaps I would like to think even a sisterhood with the anonymous activists who marched in the past, who we see in the films, etc. It really is powerful to see the numbers that came out in force and with the kind of passion that we see even today at the different marches. It existed then, and it still exists now, and we have a kind of an emotional solidarity, emotional and political solidarity with those people. So it is intergenerational in that sense. Quite often, here's another question, quite often photos show suffragists unscathed and pristinely dressed. We know that some were arrested, force-fed, and treated harshly. Can you comment about any violent confrontations while marching and why this aspect of protest is not depicted? Well, I guess it wouldn't be very popular to depict this. I mean, the humiliation was great among the sort of iron-jawed angels that were forcibly fed and put in prison, and these were like kind of elegant middle class, upper middle class women who really did go to the mat for suffrage, but they knew they were drawing attention to the cause. So, but what they did do, we have a video or a film of some of those very women reenacting their incarceration, lining up, and they sort of did a sort of pageant in which they went on trains and showed people in the heartland, what happened to them. So, so in fact, I think that very unpopular to film a humiliating aspect of the story, and therefore it's not memorialized, but they saw fit to memorialize it themselves with this reenactment film, which is also on view in our Women March exhibit. Does the next question, does the exhibit include the more recent marches and the Me Too movement? Is RBG's contribution included? Yes, and yes. I mean, we want very much to see the sort of the continuity. If we're talking 200 years from 1820 to 2020, absolutely. We want our visitors to see recent marches as part of this longer continuum. It's not about suffrage anymore. Maybe it is a little bit about voting, but it's about many other issues. And we see the power and impact of a march, of that solidarity, of the attention that marches grab, but also the drama and the power of the numbers. And so yes, we'll see, you see a video of women in more recent years marching with their pink hats. And we see the large numbers that came out in force, certainly here in New York. And RBG's contribution is included, of course, but I think that I would be remiss to not mention that coming up in a year, New York Historical and the Center for Women's History is going to be one of the venues, or I think the last venue, for the exhibition, The Notorious RBG. Because of COVID, we had to, as you all know, close the institution temporarily. And as a result, this exhibition, Women March, had just opened in early March when we had to close down. So we extended it so that more people could see it. A great deal of effort went into it. And the RBG show was pushed back, but we're very excited about being the host venue for this exhibition, which will take on new and powerful meaning, of course, when we stage it in about a year. To what extent have men been involved in activism for women's rights over the period covered by the exhibition? They have been very active, and in many, often, let's take as one example, Frederick Douglass was at the Seneca Falls Convention, and in fact, he was the one who suggested that the whole topic of suffrage be put on the table. This wasn't necessarily the main aim in 1848 of convening this group to talk about women's rights, and he felt that the vote was important too, and that was Frederick Douglass. So we do see a lot of men that are involved in throughout the years. In the Civil War era, for example, women were extremely motivated and involved in the sanitary fairs. Raised money, funds for the Union Army and for nursing. And what is quite impressive is the one in New York. They were all over sanitary fairs, all over different cities around the country. But the one in New York raised $1 million, and this was in Civil War money and dollars. And it was women who did the organizing, but at the top of the heap were men who did the larger organizing. So there was certainly a kind of solidarity and a respect for what the women were doing. But I think for the most part, we needed to see women rise up together collectively to affect change, which isn't to say that they were segregated from the men. It's just that we foreground more the women who were involved in this process. Let me see. We have a couple more questions and a few more minutes. Did such suffrage-specific marches take place all across the country in crowds both large and small? Why was upstate New York ahead of the city itself, or is that a myth? Well, I mean, it's really kind of extraordinary to think about it. Yes, I mean, there were marches and gatherings all over the country. And in fact, many of the images that we have, the group shots, for example, are from different places, different cities. So suffrage was not just a Northeastern thing. It was not just a New York thing. Obviously, we do look at history through the particular vantage point of New York City and state at New York Historical. So we see um, the larger American story, but with a particular emphasis on New York. So this is just kind of what we do. But yes, there were large crowds and smaller crowds. I think that certainly through what happened in New York, because New York was a media capital in the 19 teens, not just a bit with the newspapers, but with film, for example. The nascent film industry got its start in New York before it moved out west to Hollywood, California. We see that New York was able to advance the um, the story and the agenda more through using the media, and therefore, you know, they're we do privilege New York a bit more than we would other cities. But in fact, this is not just specific to New York alone. And about New York, what was it about Seneca Falls and upstate New York? In fact, you know, John Brown and it was Garrett Smith. There were other big abolitionists who were upstate New Yorkers. It's interesting, and I don't know enough about that particular the nuts and bolts of that topic, but even, you know, someone like Lucretia Mott, who was extremely active in at Seneca Falls and with the suffrage movement. She was from Nantucket, which in Massachusetts, 35 miles out to sea. And it's kind of extraordinary to think of this sort of Quaker society that was an incubator of this kind of radical thinking. So you find the oddest pockets when you start scratching the surface a bit more of history. So what have the next question, what have been the interconnections between the women's movement and other social justice efforts? Have there been times when these fellow activists have been close and times when they have diverged? Well, I mean, I think I did mention the fact that as we approach our own time within the last, I don't know, 50 years or so, from the 60s onward, there are, you know, identity politics. There are different agendas, and certainly the social justice efforts are huge on you know, in the feminist agenda. I'd also like to really think about this notion of waves, and by taking a long view, 200 years, and not starting at Seneca Falls, and not even really mentioning first wave, second wave, third wave. I'm not even sure what wave we're in right now, but I certainly know that there have been young women, maybe 20 years ago or so, who just didn't understand, they couldn't relate to the kind of activism of the second wave of the 1960s, and would therefore say, well, I'm not a feminist, I don't believe in that. But in if you look at this historical trajectory and you see how, you know, feminism is really an expression of human rights and equality, you can't help but be a feminist. You cannot help but appreciate the great strides and the doors that those activists open for women today, that just take that sort of their equality, their jobs, the way they're permitted to behave now. They take it for granted, and I would like to think, and I think that our team was very incumbent to advance the notion that in fact uh, we are living in a you know, in a feminist society, and but let's just not call it that necessarily, because we don't need to. When, you know, women's rights are human rights, and human rights are women's rights, and so and all of society is improved by this sort of call to action, equality, and certainly all of society is improved and by the vote, And we do encourage everyone who sees the show to go out and vote and to enact that great gift of citizenship. So in any case, I think we have unfortunately run out of time, but I thank you so very much for your time and attention and great questions. Thank you. You stumped me on a few. We'll be posting this in all of our Curator Confidential programs online for you to watch in the future. Once more, thank you for your great support of the New York Historical Society. We look forward to seeing you back here for future episodes of Curator Confidential with some of my other colleagues from New York Historical's curatorial staff. Until then, thank you and good night.